All right, welcome back to History 121. We're going to wrap up the 1920s week talking about how the good old days really weren't always so good. Essentially, what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about American agriculture around the World War I era, and honestly, how the Great Depression started in 1919 for most farmers. Before the First World War, we had this short 4-year period called the Golden Age of Agriculture. Why was 1910 to 1914 the Golden Age? Well, essentially, farmers were receiving parity prices for crops that they sold. In other words, they were making it can be a really complex issue. Essentially, farmers were being paid full profit, a full market share price of the value of their crops. And what that meant is that it made food expensive and sometimes a little scarce for city people. This is the one period of time in American history where honestly farmers were making a fair wage equal to what the city laborer was making in the factory. This was financially the best time for farmers in American history right before World War One. Things are so good that some farmers are going to start adopting the first small scale tractors. These aren't the first tractors. The first traction engines come out in the 1880s. They're slow, they're cumbersome, they're massive. You need huge fields for them to even be able to turn around in. It's really the rise of the Fordson, the Waterloo Boy, the small early tractor that we see being adopted. And they're being adopted for stationary engines to make some tasks on the farm easier to do. It's still very much a horse-powered world. We also have to remember that farmers in this period of time were still in some level self-sufficient, and that's a very tricky term because obviously you can't grow coffee in the United States. You can't grow rubber trees in the United States. There are certain products you will always have to buy. But farmers were diversified in their modes of production. You wouldn't drive by a 100-acre farm and see 98 acres of corn and a 2-acre area around the house. You would drive by a 100-acre farm and see 20 acres in wheat, 10 acres in oats, maybe another 20 acres in corn. You'd see 20 acres laying fallow as pasture. You would see very large vegetable gardens where farmers were raising fruits and vegetables for their own family's consumption. You'd see small orchards on every farm. Anything not used or not cheaply available in town was sold. Was Let me restate that. Farmers only sold those items that they did not need to grow for their own personal use. So if flour was cheap in town and readily available, you sold the entirety of your wheat crop. Your oats crop went to feed your horses because they need more than just grass to graze upon. Cows live on pasture and they live solely on grass. Your corn is going to be animal feed and you might sell some in town to supplement your income. Everything in that garden is going to get canned, pickled, or consumed fresh for your family's needs. So the farmers were able to take care of their own needs while taking part in the market. When World War I comes around, especially when it starts in Europe in 1914, American farmers are going to be told food will win the war. We need to increase production to feed not just the United States Army, but the armies of our allies. France is a battlefield, and farms are where armies fight. It's large farming districts are the only places where you can truly maneuver an army in the field. And so France isn't able to feed itself. It relies on American wheat and American dairy and American meat to feed itself. England hasn't been self-sufficient in food in decades. So they're going to buy food from us. We need to increase food production to make up for the farmers that are going off overseas to fight in the war. And we need to feed the refugees. Millions of children, millions of civilians need to be fed and taken care of. There are millions of people in Europe starving to death prior to the development of the European Relief Council under Herbert Hoover, which is going to organize a public-private partnership for food relief to European civilians during and in the wake of the war. All of this is going to garner very high crop prices, and farmers are going to expand the amount of land that they grow. Hey, I'm making such great money. I'm gonna buy out my neighbor. He's getting old. He doesn't want to farm anymore. I'm gonna buy some of his farm so I can have more land to grow. I'm not gonna grow as much food for myself because I want more food to sell on the market. It begins a self-feeding cycle where farmers are using credit to buy more land to grow more crops. And for a short period of time, they're able to handle the bills. America will send war relief resources up until 1921 to children and civilians in Western Europe to help alleviate the crises there brought on by the war. Honestly, 20 million kids are going to be saved because of the actions of Herbert Hoover and American farmers. If you're ever traveling on I-80 east of Iowa City, Iowa, and you come across West Branch, that is Herbert Hoover's hometown. The Herbert Hoover Presidential Library is located there. There is a wonderful exhibit about Hoover's role in saving the lives of millions of kids. And it is worth your time. So we have an extension of this period of high prices and high production by American farmers in response to the war effort and what the government says is needed of farmers at home. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever. Prices are going to reach an all-time high in 1917 when America joins the war. But as the war begins to wind down in 1918 and going into 1919, prices are going to begin to slide. Prices are going to begin to slip backwards to what they were even before the war into this 1910, 1914 period. So farmers are going to make less on their crops. And then suddenly in 1920, the U.S. government is going to stop giving credit to Europe. A lot of this food relief had been purchased with credit that the U.S. government had advanced to foreign governments. Hey, the war's over. You guys should have a developing, healing economy. There's no reason for us to have to pay for this stuff anymore. This is the free market. Start paying for food on your own. So that's gonna put a major dent into what European countries are buying from American farmers. Then Europe is going to start to recover on its own. Farms will go back into production. European countries will buy less and less goods, and especially food goods, from American producers. And when that happens, that end to easy credit, that end of exports to Europe, prices are going to crash. As an example, this is corn prices in Iowa on a continuum between 1896 and 1944. And here, if you look, in 1917, 1918, we have a high of about $1.21, $1.22 a bushel for corn. That's a historic high if you look at this chart. That is the most throughout this entire period that farmers are selling their goods for. And then you look at 1921. And in 1921, corn is going for less than 30 cents a bushel because we have overproduced. We have produced so much for the market, and there's no one buying this corn anymore. And without that, the price is going to fall and fall and fall until people stop flooding the market with corn. In some cases, it's basic economics. The more readily available it is, the cheaper it is. The rarer an item is, the more expensive it is. With no consumer for corn, corn prices crash. This is just one example. Wheat, dairy, cotton, tobacco, they all crash across the board. Farmers, pardon me, across the nation. Sorry, I'm still recovering from my cold. Farmers across the nation are going to continue to suffer and go into a financial free-for-all because of the end of the First World War, the closure of European markets, and the end of easy credit for European countries. We'll talk about that 1932 decline later. So how do we respond to lower prices? Farmers plant more crops. If I'm not making as much per bushel, then I need to grow more bushels of a product to make ends meet. Farmers are also going to start getting violent towards their neighbors. Farmers will burn the cornfields, the cotton fields, the tobacco fields of their neighbors because that takes some of that land out of production. And that means that if I can burn off his 20 acres of corn, maybe I can bump the price of corn up a little bit more. We're going to see some growers, especially in the South, try and create unions to help organize the sale of crops in order to negotiate higher prices, like the Farmers Union or the Burley Tobacco Growers Union. By and large, these will be rejected. They'll be rejected as communism. They'll be rejected because they can't get enough farmers to go with the union, and so farmers will go behind the union's back and sell goods on the open market, sell crops on the open market, even though they'd pledged to the union that they wouldn't. Congress will try and pass the McNary-Haugen Act twice to stabilize prices and give government a role in the agricultural markets to stabilize prices by buying surplus goods, basically creating a granary system. And conservative politicians in this country, including the president, will reject it because that's not what the government does in a democratic, capitalistic, free market system. If we're going to be free market, then people are going to suffer and people are going to be poor because it's not the government's role to interfere with the invisible hand. In essence, as a farmer, as a person living in rural America, you make do and you do the best you can. You patch your clothes. You keep that car running as long as you can. You keep growing that crop in hopes that next year you're going to get a better price. And in the meantime, your kids don't need new shoes every year. Your kids don't need a new suit. They can wear bib overalls to school because they're going to come home and work on the farm in that clothing anyway. You make do, you make it last. And that can only happen for so long until the farmers begin to fight back. One example from my own personal research is the cow war of 1931. In essence, farmers are fighting back against tuberculosis testing of their cattle. We think of tuberculosis as something that is contracted person to person. When they cough, we get some of that aerosol mucus in the air, we breathe their germs, and we catch tuberculosis. There's also a version of tuberculosis which is transmitted through milk because cattle can have their own version of tuberculosis. And so, in an attempt to wipe out what is called the White Plague in the early 20th century, the federal government and the state governments implement a type of tuberculosis testing on cattle to try and cull out sick cows. Now, what happens is if I go onto your farm and I find one of your cows is sick, I'm going to have the state of Iowa or the state of South Dakota pay for 1/3 of the value of your cow. The federal government is going to pay for 1/3 of the value of your cow. That way, when you go to buy clean cattle as replacement, you only have to pay 33% of the value of a brand new cow. There's one problem though. These are dairy farmers. And if you're if you're familiar with dairy farmers, if you grew up on a dairy farm, you know that you rely on that weekly or monthly milk check to pay the bills and feed your family in between harvests. When you harvest corn, you only get paid once in that year for harvesting that crop. With a weekly or a monthly milk check, as low as it may be, it's a pardon the pun, liquid cash income that allows you to keep a roof over your head and food on your family's table. Bovine tuberculosis testing threatens that milk check because when you go to buy a new cow, if it's not freshened, if it's not ready, if it's not old enough to be part of the dairy herd, then your milk check is diminished. In the fall of 1931, after nearly a decade of bovine tuberculosis protests, the farmers in Cedar County, Iowa, break into open rebellion against the state government. They prevent their cows from being tested. They kidnap veterinarians. They assault law enforcement, trying to save their cows in order to save that weekly milk check. Ultimately, in September of that year, the governor will have to call out the National Guard and enforce bovine tuberculosis testing at the point of a bayonet in order to make sure that public health concerns are met and taken care of in the face of this farm crisis. And again, if there would have been no farm crisis, yes, there would have been protesting. There might have been less of it. Things may not have gotten this bad. The cow war will be a complete and utter failure, but the next year, 1932, we'll see the rise of the farm holiday movement. And we'll see farm protesters again with record low prices for their crops do everything they can to try and keep people from selling goods and making prices go even lower. Because if you boycott the market, if you keep goods from being sold, then you can influence the prices that you're receiving for your crops. So farmers will block the roads. They'll famously around Sioux City, Iowa, they'll capture farmers taking milk into town and dump that milk into the ditches so that they can keep that milk off the market to get a higher price for their milk. Here we see farmers blocking the road with a farmer trying to take a cow to market to sell. We see farmers blocking the road with logs, trying to keep anybody and everybody off the market, out of taking part in the market, trying to force better prices because they aren't even making back the cost of raising a crop. And it's only after the election of 32 that the federal government will step in and create economic programming to try and make farmers' situations better. But on top of all the economic and political chaos, we're going to see in the early years of the Depression the Dust Bowl, an environmental devastation in the North American continent that really hadn't been seen in human history. That picture on the left depicts a farmer driving in front of a cloud of dust that has been whipped up by the winds. That is the topsoil of South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Colorado, parts of Iowa, parts of most of the Great Plains being whipped up and blown east into other areas, stripping the topsoil away from the Great Plains. Why was it stripped away? Because when people settled the Great Plains in the 1880s and the 1870s, they honestly settled that area in the wettest quarter century in planetary history known to the Great Plains. What that means is farmers were able to go out and conventionally raise corn and every other crop they wanted to raise by plowing in the regular manner that they plowed out east in a different environment with more rainfall. And because they were settling in this 20-year period of extreme moisture, they were getting enough soil or enough rain to keep soil moisture up. They were getting enough rain to combat evaporation. They were getting enough rain to raise corn in an area where only grass was meant to grow. By 1900, that wet period had come to an end. By the late 20s, that period was in a drought, and farmers were still conventionally plowing with horse-drawn plows, with regular equipment in an effort to make a profit off of continuously lower farm prices in an area that was increasingly harder to grow a crop. When you plow, you pulverize, you break up the topsoil in order to allow plant growth, in order to allow water to trickle down. Soil tilth is an entire college class that you could take at South Dakota State if you wished. I can't get into that. But basically, if you continue using conventional plows in a dry area with not enough rain coming in, you're going to pulverize the soil and make it almost like sand. And when windstorms come in, those windstorms are going to blacken the sky with your topsoil and blow away your ability to raise a crop. People who rented lands were pushed off their farms at the end of their leases in favor of the use of tractors and hired tractor drivers to grow a crop on hundreds of acres rather than having sharecroppers grow a crop. This is the entire basis for the grapes of wrath. And there really was a large-scale migration of people from Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Colorado, looking for jobs and a better way of life in California in a whole different environment. I would encourage you to read The Grapes of Wrath, which was written in 32 and made a movie in 33, 34, 35 with Henry Fonda almost immediately. It's an earth-shaking movie about not just the financial conditions caused by the Great Depression and the agricultural depression, but of what man will and will not do for his fellow man in these hard times. How bad does soil erosion get because of the pulverized Great Plains? This is a dust storm in Texas in 1935. That dust is hundreds of feet into the air, creating a solid wall of dirt, moving with the wind across Texas. And walls of dirt like this could stretch from Texas into Colorado, into Wyoming, and continue pushing east towards the Mississippi River. This is a farm in western South Dakota after an accumulation of these windstorms had deposited this sand-like pulverized topsoil. It's topsoil that, to bury a car means that's 4 feet deep of brand new soil right there. It was environmental devastation that took almost a complete re-education of the American farmer on the Great Plains to renew and restore agriculture out here, especially past the 100th meridian. The 100th meridian seems to be a geographic barrier where we see wetter conditions to the east and drier conditions to the west. It's almost like an East River, West River dichotomy in South Dakota. And so this is the environmental impact of the Dust Bowl at the very height of the absolute worst farming crisis in American history. Next time, we'll talk about the rise of the Roosevelt administration, how Hoover did not respond well to the Great Depression, and how FDR moved us out of the Depression and the path to war. Thank you very much for your attention this week. Hope everything goes well. I'll talk to you guys later.